There was a rule at Meridian Shipyard that no official document ever formally stated, and yet every dockworker, every engineer, every junior officer who had spent more than a season on the yard's sprawling grid of berths understood it the way people understand the location of a live wire without ever needing to be told twice. You did not linger near berth 19, and if a visiting delegation asked about the old ship docked there, you did not answer the question yourself. You found someone whose job it actually was to answer it, and you let them decide how much of the truth a stranger was ready to hear. Nobody had briefed Ambassador Sarath Vol on that rule, and so on the second day of his delegation's visit, standing at the edge of a gleaming, modern construction bay full of the newest vessels Earth's shipyards had to offer, he did exactly what every previous visitor eventually did. He looked past the polished new hulls toward the quiet, separate berth at the yard's southern edge, where a single ship sat apart from all the rest, its lines belonging unmistakably to a design generation decades older than anything nearby, its hull carrying the particular weathered patina of long, hard use rather than careful museum preservation. And he asked about it, in the mild, faintly amused tone of a man filling a lull in polite conversation. "That vessel," Vol said, gesturing toward the old ship with the particular polite dismissiveness of a diplomat who did not expect his own question to carry any real weight. "It seems something of a curiosity, docked apart from your active fleet this way. A museum piece, I would assume, kept for sentimental reasons rather than any continued practical purpose. Every established power seems to keep at least one such relic, I have found, across my own considerable diplomatic experience." Ambassador Diane Okonkwo, walking beside him, felt something in her own chest go very still, the particular, controlled stillness of a diplomat who has just heard a foreign counterpart say something considerably more consequential than he appears to realize. She had served as Earth's chief negotiator across 3 separate rounds of increasingly high-stakes discussion with the Kesron Imperium over the preceding 18 months, and in all that time, she had never once heard anyone, human or otherwise, describe that particular ship so carelessly. "She's called the Verdict Ambassador," Okonkwo said, allowing herself only the barest pause before answering. "And I would encourage you not to mistake her current berth for retirement. She remains fully operational, maintained to the same standard as any active fleet vessel, and her presence at this shipyard, particularly during a diplomatic visit of this significance, is not accidental." Vol received the correction with the same unbothered, faintly amused dismissiveness that had characterized his original comment, an easy confidence Okonkwo would later reflect, in briefings with her own senior staff, revealed considerably more about the current state of Kesron institutional memory than the ambassador himself likely intended to disclose. "I do not doubt your fleet maintains the vessel to a high technical standard, Ambassador Okonkwo. I simply observe that a single, aging warship, however well maintained, hardly represents a matter of particular diplomatic significance in the context of the considerably larger questions our 2 governments are currently negotiating." What Ambassador Vol did not know, could not have known, given the particular, carefully cultivated gap in his own delegation's briefing materials that would only become fully apparent to Earth's own diplomatic staff across the following several days of increasingly tense negotiation, was that the verdict represented not a sentimental relic maintained out of nostalgia, but the single most consequential vessel in the entire, still recent history of formal relations between Earth and the Kesron Imperium. Her name was not a coincidence, and it was not a decoration. 11 years earlier, she had delivered one. The Ashfall crisis had begun 11 years earlier, when a hardline faction within the Kesron Imperium's own military command, convinced that Earth's still modest interstellar presence represented an opportunity for decisive territorial expansion before humanity's own technological development matured beyond the point where such expansion remained feasible, had launched a coordinated strike against 3 human border colonies along the Ashfall corridor. An operation its own planners had confidently projected would conclude in swift, decisive Kesron victory before Earth's broader fleet could mobilize any meaningful response. The strike's opening hours had unfolded almost exactly as the Kesron hardliners had projected. 2 of the 3 targeted colonies fell to direct occupation within the first day, their modest planetary defense forces overwhelmed before any meaningful resistance could be organized. The 3rd colony, a mining settlement called Coravale Housing, just under 9,000 civilians, found itself under sustained orbital bombardment, its own defense grid failing section by section as the Kesron strike force methodically dismantled whatever resistance the colony's outnumbered garrison could muster. Emergency transmissions from Coravale, growing more desperate with each passing hour, painted a picture that Earth's own crisis command received with a dawning, sickening understanding that no reinforcement could possibly arrive in time to prevent a considerable loss of civilian life. No reinforcement, that is, except one. The verdict, then Earth's newest and most technologically advanced capital vessel, had been conducting a routine systems trial in a neighboring sector when the first distress calls from the Ashfall corridor reached her command deck. And her captain, a young, relatively untested officer named Elena Marsh, who had held her commission for barely 14 months, made the decision that would define the remainder of her career, and in a considerably larger sense, the remainder of Earth-Kesron relations for the following decade. She did not wait for orders. She altered course toward the Ashfall corridor within minutes of receiving the first distress signal, understanding, with a clarity her own subsequent testimony would describe simply as the math was not complicated, that her ship represented the only asset in the entire sector capable of reaching Coravale before its defenses collapsed entirely. She arrived alone. Her tactical officer at the time, a young lieutenant named Idris Kanu, who would go on to serve alongside Marsh for the remainder of her career, later described the moment the verdict dropped out of transit into the Ashfall corridor's outer system as the single most disorienting experience of his entire service. We came out of transit into a tactical picture that made no sense against anything our own pre-mission briefing had prepared us for, Kanu recalled, in testimony given years later as part of the crisis's official historical record. 2 colonies already dark, their defense grids showing catastrophic damage. A 3rd under active bombardment, its own distress channel still transmitting, still begging for help that our own sensors told us with brutal clarity was not coming from anywhere else in time. And a Kesron strike force between us and that 3rd colony, considerably larger than a single ship, however capable, had any reasonable expectation of successfully engaging alone. Captain Marsh gave the order to advance within 90 seconds of that picture resolving on our displays. I remember thinking, in that moment, that I did not know whether I was watching genuine courage or the kind of decision that gets a crew killed for a cause that ultimately fails anyway. I would not know which one it actually was for nearly 3 more days. Captain Marsh, upon reaching the Ashfall corridor to find 2 of 3 targeted colonies already under direct Kesron occupation, and the 3rd under active, ongoing bombardment, made a series of tactical decisions across the crisis's opening 72 hours that her own subsequent official commendation would describe, in language considerably more restrained than the actual events warranted, as decisive engagement conducted under extreme resource constraint and severe numerical disadvantage. The verdict, unsupported for the crisis's first full day before any additional Earth forces could arrive, engaged and ultimately disabled the Kesron Strike Force's own flagship in a running battle that her own bridge crew would later describe, almost uniformly, as the longest day of their lives. She disrupted the coordinated bombardment of Coravale sufficiently to allow the colony's surviving population to shelter successfully underground. And across the following 2 days of sustained, punishing engagement, as additional Earth vessels finally began arriving to reinforce her, she inflicted losses on the broader Kesron strike force severe enough that the Imperium's own military command, upon receiving full reports of the engagement's outcome, made the decision to withdraw the entire operation rather than commit the additional reinforcements that continued engagement would have required. 9,000 civilians lived because one ship refused to wait for permission to save them. Among them was a young mining technician named Osai Aldana, 23 years old at the time, who had spent the crisis's most desperate hours sheltering in a reinforced storage tunnel 3 levels beneath Coravale's surface with over 400 of his neighbors, listening to the muffled percussion of orbital bombardment through solid rock and wondering, along with everyone crowded into that tunnel, whether the next impact would be the one that finally broke through. He would later become, entirely without seeking the role, one of the crisis's most freak. Ently interviewed civilian survivors, called upon repeatedly across the following decade to describe, for historians and journalists and eventually diplomatic training programs on both sides of the Ashfall settlement, exactly what it had felt like to be one of the people the verdict had actually saved. We didn't know a single ship had arrived until the bombardment simply stopped, Aldana told an interviewer some years after the crisis, in an account that would eventually be included, at Webb's own insistence, in the formal briefing materials distributed to visiting diplomatic delegations touring the verdict. There was no announcement, no warning that help was coming. One moment the ground was shaking with every impact, and children in that tunnel were crying, and grown adults who I'd known my whole life were praying out loud for the first time I'd ever heard them do it. And then it just stopped, and it stayed stopped, and it was nearly 6 hours before anyone told us why. 6 hours of not knowing whether the silence meant we'd been saved or simply that the bombardment had moved somewhere else first. I think about that silence more than I think about the noise, if I'm honest. The noise was terrifying, but at least the noise made sense. The silence was worse in its own way because we had no idea yet what it meant. Aldana's account, delivered with the plain, unpolished honesty of a man who had never trained as a public speaker and had no particular interest in becoming one, carried a weight in diplomatic briefings that Webb's own carefully documented tactical histories, however precise, could never fully replicate. Okonkwo herself had arranged, in the weeks following the successful conclusion of Val's negotiation, for Aldana's testimony to be formally incorporated into the standard historical materials provided to any future delegation touring the verdict, a decision she explained simply. Admiral Marsh can tell a delegation what the ship did. Only someone who lived through what the ship prevented can tell them what it actually meant. The formal armistice that concluded the Ashfall crisis, negotiated over the following several months between Earth's diplomatic corps and a considerably more cautious Kesron government forced to reckon publicly with its own hardline military faction's catastrophic miscalculation, had established not merely the territorial and diplomatic terms governing subsequent Earth-Kesron relations, but a specific, deliberate diplomatic practice that few outside Earth's own senior defense and diplomatic establishment fully understood the significance of, that the verdict herself, rather than being retired or reassigned to routine fleet duty following the crisis's conclusion, would be maintained in continuous, fully operational readiness, and would be present, docked visibly and accessibly, at any facility hosting significant diplomatic engagement with Kesron representatives. The decision was not intended as provocation. Fleet historian Captain Marcus Webb, retired from active service but retained by Earth's defense establishment specifically to oversee the verdict's continued maintenance and historical documentation, explained to Okonkwo's own staff during a briefing convened shortly after Val's dismissive comment first reached her attention. It was intended as memory, deliberately and carefully maintained. The armistice that ended the Ashfall crisis depended in no small part on the Kesron Imperium's own government genuinely internalizing exactly what their hardline faction's miscalculation had nearly cost them, and exactly what capability stood ready to answer any future repetition of that miscalculation. Ships get decommissioned. Records get archived and eventually forgotten by anyone not specifically tasked with remembering them. We made a deliberate choice, in the crisis's immediate aftermath, that the verdict herself would remain the single most visible, undeniable piece of evidence, that this particular history was not going to simply fade into the kind of comfortable, distant memory that eventually allows old lessons to lose their practical weight. Webb himself had been among the small group of defense officials who first proposed the arrangement, over the objections of several colleagues who considered the expense of maintaining a single ship in permanent operational readiness, purely for the purpose of diplomatic display, an unnecessary indulgence better spent on conventional fleet modernization. He had spent 11 years since defending that original decision, quietly, patiently, across a succession of budget reviews and institutional skeptics. And Okonkwo's own briefing that afternoon marked, in a sense he did not yet fully appreciate, the first genuine test of whether the arrangement's underlying premise actually worked. If Ambassador Val's own delegation genuinely does not understand the verdict's significance, Okonkwo said, absorbing Webb's account with the articular professional unease of a diplomat recognizing that a carefully maintained institutional message appeared to be failing entirely to reach its intended audience. What does that suggest about the current state of Kesron institutional memory regarding the Ashfall crisis more broadly? And what does it suggest about the actual stakes of the negotiations we are currently conducting with a delegation that may not fully appreciate the history underlying our own government's current negotiating posture? Webb's answer, delivered with the particular gravity of an officer who had spent 11 years specifically tasked with ensuring exactly this kind of institutional forgetting, did not occur on Earth's own side of the relationship, carried a weight that would shape Okonkwo's own approach to the negotiations' increasingly tense final days. I would suggest, Ambassador, that you consider the possibility that Ambassador Val's dismissiveness is not merely a personal diplomatic oversight, but a symptom of a broader shift within Kesron's own current government, one your own intelligence briefings have already flagged with some concern. The gradual return to influence of political and military factions, considerably more sympathetic to the same expansionist thinking that produced the Ashfall crisis in the first place, now operating within a government whose institutional memory of exactly how that thinking concluded appears to have faded considerably more than our own careful, deliberate efforts ever intended to permit. Okonkwo herself had built her own diplomatic career on a foundational principle she credited directly to her earliest mentor within Earth's foreign service, a principle that made Vol's careless comment about the verdict considerably more alarming to her than it might have seemed to a less experienced negotiator. That the surest sign a negotiation's true stakes exceeded its official agenda was a foreign counterpart's careless dismissal of something the historical record showed to be genuinely consequential. She had seen the pattern before, twice in her earlier career, and both times it had preceded a negotiation considerably more fraught than its opening sessions initially suggested. She did not yet know, standing in that construction bay watching Vol's easy, unbothered smile, exactly how fraught this particular negotiation was about to become. But some old, well-earned instinct told her, even in that first moment, that she needed to find out quickly. Okonkwo's own intelligence staff, reviewing the composition of Vol's delegation and the specific language of his government's negotiating brief in the days that followed, found Webb's suspicion considerably more substantiated than she had initially hoped it would be. Analyst Priya Desmukh, who had spent the preceding 6 months tracking shifts in Kesron domestic politics as part of her own standing intelligence brief, delivered an assessment that added a genuinely alarming dimension to what had, until that point, seemed a merely troubling diplomatic oversight. "Ambassador, I want to flag something that I don't believe is coincidental," Desmukh told Okonkwo, in a private briefing convened the evening before the negotiations' 4th session. 3 of the 7 senior military advisors currently attached to Vol's delegation previously served under General Kesrin Vol, the officer who commanded the original Kesron strike force during the Ashfall crisis, and who was, following the crisis's conclusion, formally censured but never fully removed from influence within Kesron's broader military establishment. I don't believe it's a coincidence that a delegation stocked with officers sympathetic to Vol's original strategic thinking has arrived here proposing exactly the kind of security provision rollback that Vol's own faction has spent the past decade quietly advocating for. I believe this negotiation is considerably higher stakes than its official agenda suggests. The negotiations themselves, addressing a proposed revision to the original Ashfall Armistice's territorial provisions that would grant the Kesron Imperium expanded trade access to several contested border systems, in exchange for formal, permanent recognition of Earth's own territorial claims along the corridor, had proceeded across their first several sessions with a cordial, professional tone that gave Okonkwo's own staff little immediate cause for alarm beyond the underlying intelligence concerns Webb's and Desmukh's briefings had crystallized. That tone shifted markedly during the negotiations' 4th session, when Vol's own delegation introduced a proposed amendment that Okonkwo recognized immediately as considerably more consequential than its careful diplomatic phrasing initially suggested. "My government proposes," Vol said, presenting the amendment with the same polite, unhurried confidence that had characterized his earlier dismissal of the verdict, "a reconsideration of Th. Original armistices, provision restricting Kesron military presence within the Ashfall corridor's outer boundary. We believe, 11 years removed from the unfortunate circumstances that originally produced that restriction, that continued limitation on ordinary Kesron defensive patrol activity within our own historically claimed territory no longer serves either government's genuine interests, and we would propose a phased reduction of that restriction as part of this negotiation's broader final settlement. The chamber went very quiet. Okonkwo felt every member of her own staff turn, almost imperceptibly, toward her, waiting to see how she would answer a proposal that struck at the exact foundation the verdict's continued vigil had been built to protect. Ambassador Vol, I want to be direct with you about how this proposal will be received, she said, keeping her voice level though something considerably sharper moved beneath it. The restriction on Kesron military presence within the Ashfall Corridor's outer boundary was not an arbitrary or punitive provision. It was a specific, carefully negotiated response to a specific, documented military action that resulted in significant loss of life across 3 human colonies, an action that concluded only because of a decisive human military response your own government's negotiators, at the time, formally acknowledged as fully justified given the circumstances your own hardline faction created. I would ask your delegation to reconsider whether proposing its removal, so soon after your own ambassador characterized the very vessel responsible for that decisive response as an insignificant curiosity, sends precisely the message your government intends it to send. Vol's own composure, for the first time across the negotiation's several sessions, showed a genuine flicker of uncertainty, though whether that uncertainty reflected authentic surprise at Okonkwo's pointed connection between his earlier comment and the current proposal, or simply discomfort at having the connection made explicit in formal session, Okonkwo herself could not immediately determine. I do not believe my earlier observation regarding the vessel's berthing was intended to carry the diplomatic significance you appear to be attributing to it, Ambassador Okonkwo. I would ask that we not allow an incidental comment to color this council's consideration of a proposal my government believes represents a genuine, good-faith effort toward normalized long-term relations between our 2 peoples. The session concluded without resolution, and Okonkwo, reviewing the day's proceedings with her own senior staff that evening, found herself confronting a diplomatic situation whose genuine stakes extended considerably beyond the specific territorial provision currently under discussion. I do not believe Ambassador Vol is personally acting in bad faith, she told her staff, turning a stylus over in her fingers with the particular restlessness of someone thinking through a problem she had not yet fully solved. I believe he genuinely does not understand, or has not been adequately briefed on, exactly what the verdict represents, and I believe that gap in his own understanding reflects a broader gap within his government's current institutional memory regarding the Ashfall crisis, one that his government's more hardline factions may well be actively cultivating. Precisely because a government that has forgotten why a restriction exists is a government considerably more susceptible to proposals for removing it. She requested and received the following morning an unusual accommodation from Earth's own defense establishment: formal authorization to arrange a direct demonstration of the verdict's continued operational status and historical significance, delivered not as a threat, but as precisely the kind of institutional memory restoration Webb's own briefing had suggested the current negotiations genuinely required. I want to be clear about what I am proposing and what I am not proposing, she told Fleet Admiral Elena Marsh, now retired from active command but still serving in an advisory capacity to Earth's defense establishment, and the same officer whose own decisive command of the verdict during the Ashfall crisis's opening days had first established the vessel's significance. I am not proposing any demonstration intended as intimidation or threat. I am proposing a formal historical briefing, delivered directly by yourself if you are willing. That ensures Ambassador Voll's delegation possesses an accurate, complete understanding of exactly what they are currently negotiating around. Before this negotiation proceeds any further on the basis of what appears to be a significant gap in their own government's institutional memory. Admiral Marsh had not set foot aboard the Verdict in nearly 3 years, a fact Okonkwo learned only after the request was already made, and one that lent the following wise briefing a weight even Okonkwo herself had not fully anticipated. Marsh considered the request with the particular measured seriousness of an officer who had spent the 11 years since the Ashfall crisis's conclusion largely avoiding public discussion of an engagement she had never personally regarded with anything resembling triumph, and she agreed to the briefing with a condition of her own. I will provide the historical account, Ambassador, factually and without embellishment. But I want it understood by your own staff and by Ambassador Voll's delegation both, that I do not offer this account to relitigate old grievances or to intimidate a delegation currently engaged in good faith negotiation. I offer it because I believe genuine peace between our two peoples depends on both sides accurately remembering exactly what nearly broke that peace in the first place. And I have found, across considerable subsequent experience, that forgetting how a conflict actually unfolded tends to make its repetition considerably more likely, not less. The briefing, convened the following day aboard the Verdict herself rather than in any conventional diplomatic setting, began with Admiral Marsh meeting Ambassador Voll's delegation at the vessel's own boarding ramp, an arrangement that Okonkwo had specifically requested precisely, because she believed the ship's own physical presence, experienced directly rather than simply described, would communicate something that no purely verbal briefing could adequately convey. The air inside the ship's entry corridor still carried the faint, particular smell of a working vessel, coolant and metal and recycled atmosphere, nothing at all like the sealed, sanitized quiet of a museum piece, and Okonkwo watched Voll's own expression shift, almost imperceptibly as that reality settled over him. Marsh led them deeper into the ship before beginning her formal account, pausing first in a cramped berthing compartment that still held, mounted on one wall with quiet, unceremonious permanence, a simple plaque bearing the names of the 7 crew members who had not survived the engagement's opening day. She did not linger on it, did not gesture toward it, or draw the delegation's attention with any particular emphasis. She simply let them see it in passing, the way anyone aboard the ship saw it every day, an ordinary fixture of an ordinary corridor rather than a curated exhibit built for a visitor's benefit. Voll's own gaze caught on it anyway, and Okonkwo watched him read the 7 names in full before the delegation moved on. Ambassador Voll, Marsh said, as the Kesron delegation boarded a vessel whose interior, despite its considerable age, showed no evidence whatsoever of the kind of ceremonial, museum-like preservation Voll's own earlier comment had assumed. I understand you characterized this vessel as a curiosity, kept for sentimental reasons rather than continued practical purpose. I would ask you to walk her command deck with me, and to understand, before this negotiation proceeds any further, exactly what continued practical purpose she actually serves. She led the delegation through the ship's still fully operational command systems, past consoles whose displays flickered with the same live, active telemetry any current fleet vessel would show, past a weapons bay whose status board read, without any ceremony at all, simply ready, Her own account of the Ashfall crisis's opening 72 hours was delivered with the flat, unembellished precision of an officer who had spent considerable subsequent years learning to discuss the engagement's genuine cost without either minimizing or dramatizing what had actually occurred. We arrived at the Ashfall corridor with 2 of 3 targeted colonies already under direct occupation, and the third under active bombardment that had, by the time we reached effective engagement range, already claimed considerable civilian casualties, she said, standing on a command deck whose every console and instrument remained precisely as functional as they had been 11 years earlier. I commanded a single vessel against a strike force considerably larger than our own, for the better part of a full day, before any additional Earth forces could reach the corridor. I did not know in those opening hours whether reinforcement would arrive in time to matter, or whether my own crew and I would simply be the first casualties in a considerably longer conflict. I do not offer you these details to impress upon your delegation any particular martial pride in what this ship accomplished. I offer them because I believe your own government's proposal to reduce restrictions on military presence within this same corridor deserves to be considered by officials who genuinely understand, in specific and accurate detail, exactly what those restrictions were established to prevent from happening again. One of Vol's own military advisors, a stern, silent officer Nam, Ed Colonel Disik Mar, who had served under General Vol during the original Ashfall operation, and whose presence on this delegation Desmuk's intelligence briefing had specifically flagged, spoke for the first time since boarding, his voice carrying an edge that betrayed more than he likely intended. You describe this engagement as though your own vessel single-handedly determined its outcome, Admiral. I would note that General Vol's own withdrawal decision reflected broader strategic considerations extending well beyond the actions of a single ship. Marsh turned to face him directly, her own composure entirely unshaken. Colonel, I have read General Vol's own after-action report, submitted to his superiors within the month following the crisis's conclusion, a document I suspect you have also read, given your service under his command. That report states, in his own words, that continued engagement following the loss of his flagship and the disruption of the Coravale bombardment carried unacceptable risk relative to any remaining strategic objective. I am not asking your delegation to accept my own characterization of this engagement's significance. I am asking you to accept your own commanding officer's formal, written assessment of it, submitted at the time, before any subsequent institutional softening had the opportunity to reshape how this crisis came to be remembered within your own government's records. Mar said nothing further, though the look he exchanged with Vol carried a weight Okonkwo did not fail to notice. Ambassador Vol, standing on a command deck whose evident, continued operational readiness contradicted every assumption underlying his own earlier dismissive comment, found himself confronting a historical account considerably more detailed and considerably more immediate than whatever briefing his own government had apparently provided before this delegation's departure. I want to be honest with you, Admiral, he said, after a long moment of evident, genuine reconsideration. My own briefing materials characterize the Ashfall crisis in considerably more abstract terms than what you have just described. A regrettable military miscalculation, formally resolved through subsequent diplomatic settlement, with relatively limited emphasis on the specific tactical details of how that resolution was actually achieved. I do not believe I fully appreciated, before this briefing, exactly how directly this specific vessel's own actions shaped the settlement my government is currently proposing to partially revise. That gap in your own briefing does not surprise me, Ambassador, Marsh answered. I have observed, across the 11 years since this crisis concluded, a gradual but consistent pattern in how institutional memory of costly military miscalculations tends to fade within the government responsible for the miscalculation itself, even as the government that ultimately answered it maintains, quite deliberately, a considerably more vivid and specific accounting. I do not believe this pattern reflects any particular bad faith on your own government's part. I believe it reflects a simple, common institutional tendency to remember one's own failures in softer terms than the party who bore their direct consequence ever finds equally comfortable to forget. Vol did not sleep well that night. Okonkwo learned this only much later, from Vol himself, in a conversation the two diplomats shared several years afterward at an unrelated summit, when enough time had passed that the admission carried more warmth than professional risk. He had walked the verdict's outer gantry alone after the delegation's official tour concluded. He told her, standing for a long while in the cold dockside air looking up at a hull he had, less than 48 hours earlier, dismissed without a second thought. I kept returning to the plaque in that berthing compartment, he said. 7 names, no ceremony around them at all, just left there for anyone who happened to pass by to read. I realized, standing on that gantry, that I had built my entire understanding of your corridor's security provisions on a version of history considerably tidier than the one those 7 names actually represented. I did not sleep, Ambassador Okonkwo, because I was rewriting, in my own head, the report I intended to deliver the following morning, and I wanted to be certain I delivered it honestly rather than simply expediently. Vol returned to the negotiating table the following day with a formal request to withdraw his delegation's proposed amendment regarding military presence restrictions, a request he delivered with a directness that Okonkwo recognized as genuinely reflecting the previous day's briefing's impact, rather than any merely tactical diplomatic retreat. My government's proposal was developed based on an institutional understanding of the Ashfall crisis that I now believe was considerably incomplete, he told the assembled. Negotiating session. I do not believe it would be appropriate for this delegation to continue advocating for a provision whose original justification I have only just come to fully understand. I will be recommending, in my own formal report to my government, that any future proposal touching on the Ashfall Corridor's security arrangements be developed with considerably more direct engagement with the specific historical record than appears to have informed this delegation's original mandate. Colonel Marr objected within the hour, requesting a private session with his own delegation that Okonkwo's own intelligence staff, monitoring the negotiations' broader diplomatic traffic through entirely legitimate channels, learned had grown considerably heated. Ambassador Vol, I would remind you that this delegation's mandate was established by the Council prior to our departure, and that mandate did not include discretion to unilaterally withdraw provisions based on a single afternoon's persuasive presentation, Marr argued, according to an account later shared by a junior member of Vol's own staff who found the exchange troubling enough to mention, quietly, to Okonkwo's team. General Vol's faction has spent a decade working toward exactly this restoration of legitimate Kesron presence within our own historically claimed territory. I would ask you to reconsider before you throw away that progress on the strength of one old ship and one carefully staged tour. Vol's response, according to the same account, proved considerably firmer than Marr appeared to have expected. I did not find the tour staged, Colonel. I found it honest. In a way, I do not believe our own government's briefing materials were honest with this delegation before we departed. I have read General Vall's own after-action report myself, this evening in full, rather than the summary our briefing provided. Admiral Marsh's account matched it precisely, in every material detail. I will not continue advocating for a provision built on a version of history I now believe my own government constructed specifically to make advocating for it easier. If you wish to formally object to my decision, you are welcome to do so through proper channels once we return home. I will not object to that objection. I will simply decline to change my own recommendation in the meantime. Word of Vall's decision reached Earth's own Secretary of Defense within hours, delivered by Okonkwo herself in a brief, carefully worded transmission that nonetheless carried, beneath its formal diplomatic language, a genuine sense of relief at an outcome that had, only days earlier, seemed considerably less certain. Secretary Amara Whitfield, reviewing the full account of the negotiations' fourth session and the briefing that followed it, found herself reflecting on a question that had occupied a considerable portion of her own tenure. Whether the verdict's continued maintenance, an expense her own predecessors had periodically questioned, remained justified against the steadily accumulating cost of keeping a single vessel in permanent, dedicated readiness, rather than folding her into the ordinary rotation of Earth's broader fleet. I have read 3 separate budget reviews over the past decade recommending we reconsider the verdict's special status, Whitfield told her own senior staff, in the briefing convened to review the negotiations' successful conclusion. Each of those reviews made a reasonable, defensible fiscal argument. I am glad, in light of what just happened at Meridian Shipyard, that none of them ultimately prevailed. I do not know that I can quantify, in any budget line item, the value of a single afternoon's briefing preventing what might otherwise have become a considerably more serious erosion of the Ashfall settlement's core protections. But I know enough, having read Ambassador Okonkwo's account of that negotiation, to believe the value was real and considerable, and worth every credit this program has cost across the 11 years we have maintained it. The negotiations concluded, several weeks later, with a settlement that preserved the original armistice's core security provisions while genuinely expanding trade access in ways both delegations characterized as a meaningful, durable improvement in Earth-Kesron relations, an outcome that Okonkwo would later credit, in her own formal after-action assessment, directly to the briefing Admiral Marsh had agreed to provide. I do not believe this settlement would have concluded on terms this favorable to both sides if Ambassador Vall's delegation had continued negotiating from a position of genuine institutional ignorance regarding what the Ashfall Corridor's security provisions actually protect against, she wrote. The verdict's continued presence at facilities hosting Kesron diplomatic engagement was never intended as mere symbolism, and this negotiation demonstrated, with a clarity I do not believe any of us fully anticipated when Ambassador Vall first dismissed her as an insignificant curiosity, exactly why that continued, deliberate presence matters. A message maintained without being genuinely understood by its intended audience is not actually a functioning deterrent. It is simply an old ship sitting quietly in a berth, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question about why she is there. The cost of that advocacy arrived sooner than Vall himself had anticipated. Within a year of the negotiations' conclusion, he found himself passed over for an ambassadorship he had spent much of his career working toward, a position that went instead to a diplomat with closer ties to Vall's remaining allies within the Kesron Foreign Ministry. He accepted the disappointment, by his own later account, with less bitterness than he might have expected of himself before Meridian Shipyard. I told myself, the day I learned I would not receive that post, that I had walked onto a ship expecting to find a curiosity, and had instead found a verdict on exactly the kind of diplomat I had been content to remain, he said, in a private reflection shared years later with a junior colleague who had asked him whether the setback had ever made him regret speaking so plainly. I decided that verdict was worth considerably more to me than the post I lost because of it. Ambassador Sarath Vol, in the years following the negotiations' conclusion, became, somewhat unexpectedly, one of the more consistent advocates within the Kesron Imperium's own diplomatic establishment for expanded historical education regarding the Ashfall crisis, a position that cost him considerable standing among the same hardline factions Colonel Marr represented, but that he pursued regardless with a persistence that surprised even his own colleagues. He explained his reasoning in a retrospective address delivered some years later to a gathering of Kesron diplomatic trainees, with a directness that reflected his own genuine reckoning with the negotiations' most uncomfortable lesson. I stood aboard a ship I had called an insignificant curiosity, and discovered, within the span of a single briefing, exactly how thoroughly my own government's institutional memory had softened an event whose actual, specific details remained, on the other side of that relationship, precisely and deliberately preserved, he told the assembled trainees. I do not believe this gap emerged through any single deliberate act of institutional dishonesty. I believe it emerged the way most such gaps emerge, gradually, through generations of officials each finding it slightly more comfortable to describe a costly failure in softer terms than the officials before them, until the original, specific weight of what actually occurred has been worn smooth by exactly the kind of comfortable forgetting no diplomat should ever allow themselves to indulge. I would ask each of you, before you ever again negotiate on behalf of this Imperium regarding any historical matter, to seek out the specific, detailed, uncomfortable account, rather than accepting whatever softened institutional summary your own briefing materials happen to provide. I promise you, from direct and somewhat humbling personal experience, that the other side of your negotiation very likely remembers the specific details considerably more precisely than your own government's official history currently does. A trainee near the front of the hall, evidently troubled by the practical implications of Vol's account, raised a question that several of her colleagues appeared equally eager to have addressed. Ambassador, if our own government's institutional memory has genuinely softened across a single decade, how can any of us trust that the historical briefings we receive before future negotiations are accurate at all? Does this not suggest a considerably deeper problem than a single delegation's mandate? Vol considered the question with the same careful seriousness he had brought to his own reckoning aboard the verdict. I believe it does suggest a deeper problem, and I do not believe I can offer you a fully satisfying solution to it beyond this. Trust the specific over the general. A briefing that describes an event in abstract, softened terms, without specific names, specific numbers, specific documented decisions, should be treated as incomplete until you have sought out the more granular record for yourself. I did not fully understand the Ashfall crisis until I stood on a command deck and heard a woman describe, in exact and unflinching detail, what it cost her personally to hold that ship together for a full day against a force she had no guarantee of surviving. No summary I was given beforehand carried anything close to that same weight. I would ask each of you to develop the habit of seeking that weight out deliberately, rather than waiting for circumstance to force it upon you the way it was forced upon me. Colonel Marr's own subsequent career took a considerably different trajectory than the one he had presumably imagined for himself when the delegation first departed Kesron's space. General Val's faction, upon learning of Val's decision and the briefing that had produced it, moved quickly to distance itself publicly from what its own internal communications characterized as a diplomatic misstep, leaving Marr, who had advocated most forcefully for the withdrawn provision, to bear a disproportionate share of the resulting institutional embarrassment. He was reassigned, within the year, to a considerably less prominent administrative posting, a demotion in all but formal title that several of his own former colleagues privately attributed less to any specific failure on his part than to his usefulness. In the moment, as a visible example of exactly the outdated thinking Val's own report had implicitly criticized. Des Muck, reflecting on the broader pattern the crisis had revealed in a debrief conducted with Okonkwo's senior staff some months after the negotiations' conclusion, offered a note of caution against treating the episode as fully, permanently resolved. I want to flag that Val's own personal conversion, however genuine, does not necessarily reflect a broader shift within the Kesron government as a whole, she said. General Val's faction absorbed a setback in this specific negotiation, but factions of that kind rarely disappear entirely following a single reversal. I would recommend this program treat Val's delegation as a successful outcome in one specific instance, rather than as evidence that the underlying institutional tendency toward comfortable historical forgetting has been permanently corrected on the Kesron side. I suspect we will need to have some version of this same conversation again, with some future delegation, sooner than any of us would prefer. Fleet historian Captain Marcus Webb, continuing his own long stewardship of the verdict's maintenance and historical documentation in the years following the successful negotiation, reflected on the episode as validation of a philosophy he had championed, sometimes against considerable institutional skepticism, since the vessel's original preservation was first proposed in the Ashfall crisis's immediate aftermath. There were officials in those early discussions 11 years ago who argued that maintaining a single vessel in continuous operational readiness, specifically for diplomatic display, represented an unnecessary expense better allocated toward more conventional fleet modernization. He said, in his own reflection on the episode, delivered during an internal defense establishment retrospective convened to formally document the negotiations' lessons for future reference. I argued then, and I continue to believe now, that the verdict's value was never primarily tactical. It was mnemonic. She exists to remember, specifically and vividly, what happens when a hardline faction's confident miscalculation goes untested by anyone willing to answer it decisively. And she exists to ensure that memory remains available, in specific and undeniable form, to exactly the delegation that most needs to encounter it. At exactly the moment that delegation's own government's comfortable forgetting might otherwise lead them back toward repeating the mistake that originally required her existence. Webb's own retirement, several years after the negotiations' conclusion, prompted a formal review of exactly how the verdict's continued maintenance program should be sustained once its original architect no longer personally oversaw it. A review that concluded, after considerable internal debate, that the program's core principle deserved formal institutionalization rather than continued dependence on any single official's personal advocacy. I did not want this program's survival to depend on my own continued presence indefinitely, Webb told the review committee during his own final testimony before stepping back from active oversight. A deterrent maintained only through one person's personal persistence is not actually a stable institution. It is a fragile habit, one crisis or one budget review away from quietly lapsing. I would ask this committee to ensure the verdict's role, and the broader principle she represents, outlives my own tenure by a considerable margin, because I believe the lesson she teaches is one this government will need considerably longer than any single career can realistically span. The committee's eventual recommendation, adopted formally the following year, established a rotating stewardship position specifically tasked with the verdict's continued historical documentation and maintenance oversight. Staffed by an officer selected every 5 years through a formal review process designed to ensure the role's continuation would never again depend on any single individual's personal initiative. Webb himself was invited to attend the commissioning ceremony marking his successor's formal appointment, an invitation he accepted with a quiet satisfaction he did not attempt to disguise. I built this program because I believed, 11 years ago, that a government which forgets the specific cost of its own hardest lessons is a government that eventually repeats them, he told the small gathering assembled for the handover. I am content to step back now, knowing this belief will continue being tested and defended long after I am no longer the one doing the testing myself. Os Aldana attended the ceremony as well, invited at Okonkwo's own personal request, standing near the back of the small crowd with the particular quiet discomfort of a man who had never quite grown, accustomed to being treated as a figure of historical significance, rather than simply someone who had survived something terrible. He was asked by a young officer curious about his presence, why he continued accepting invitations to events like this one, years after the crisis that had first drawn him into the public eye. Because somebody has to keep saying what it actually felt like underground, not knowing, he said. The tactical reports say what the ship did. I'm the only one who can say what it meant to the people the ship did it for. I figure that's worth showing up for, even now, even though I'd honestly rather just go back to the mines and not think about any of it most days. Admiral Elena Marsh, in her own final public reflection on the episode, delivered during a ceremony marking the verdict's continued formal commissioning some years after the negotiations' conclusion, offered a perspective that connected her own personal experience commanding the vessel during its most consequential engagement to the broader lesson its subsequent diplomatic role had come to represent. I did not command this ship believing I was creating a symbol, she said, standing once more on the same command deck where she had once spent a full, desperate day holding a line she had no guarantee she could hold. I commanded her because 9,000 people across one colony needed someone to answer an attack that was, at the time, actively underway, and because no other vessel could reach them in time to matter. I did not know in those hours whether I was making the right decision or simply the only decision available to me. I have had 11 years since to sit with that uncertainty, and I do not believe it has ever fully resolved, nor do I believe it should. Whatever significance she has carried since that engagement, she carries because Earth's own government made a deliberate, thoughtful choice afterward to ensure the memory of what she accomplished, and what she prevented would not simply fade into the comfortable distance that eventually allows old lessons to lose their weight. She paused, looking out at the assembled crowd, her own gaze finding, briefly, the quiet, weathered hull of the ship behind her. I would ask everyone gathered here today to understand that a ship, however capable, is never truly what maintains peace between two peoples. What maintains peace is the harder, more deliberate work of ensuring that both sides genuinely remember, specifically and honestly, exactly what that peace was built to prevent from happening again. Ambassador Vol called this vessel a curiosity because his own government had allowed itself to forget what she represented. I would ask that none of us, on either side of this relationship, ever allow that particular forgetting to happen again. Because the day it happens again on either side is the day this ship stops being a memory and has to become, once more, exactly what she was built to be the first time.